my share.
Okay.
Okay, let's start. It's 6:40 our lecture time. Last week, we have seen how financial instruments has affected the 2008 oil price spike. And this week, we have an excellent guest, which I have enjoyed his book more than any other in the last 2 or 3 years. And he's a brilliant writer in the sense that he gives us the structure of why oil prices act this way. So after reading his book, when I look to the long-term oil prices, I can see that the ages of order and chaos and whether anyone is in control of the markets or not. So therefore, I'm very grateful to Bob McNally for joining us and giving his presentation. So you remember let me do from here. Okay. You remember we have come this far, and this Saturday and tomorrow we will have Gökçe Mete about Europe, how Europe energy policies have been affected by these transition dialogues and Russian gas disputes, energy union, Green Deal, and this is an important one. So tomorrow at 6:40, we will be joining with Gökçe Mete from Brussels Energy Charter. So she will be talking about the pretext of week 9, which is natural gas disruption and European experience. And then we will go with the Australian energy crisis, how renewables come and how LNG boomed in Australia and coal. And then we'll go to climate change and Turkey's energy crisis. So today we have Robert and Bob McNally, as he calls himself. His book, Crude, Volatility, I believe is a must read for understanding what's happening in the oil markets. We will listen to him shortly. And this is the one graph which sticks to my mind when I look to any oil thing. This is his graph, which is, I have never seen any graph in any other book, so this is his creation. And this perfectly illustrates why prices are volatile in certain ages, and while it is not, and while booms or busts are coming. So we will listen the history from this original writer. And during last night and for 2 days, I was trying to make ready some questions for Bob, so not looking like an amateur. So I read the epilogue again. I read some chapters again. Let me give you some. Look, this book is written like 4 years ago, I believe, for 5 years ago, for 3 or 4 years ago.
Yep, 4 years ago, yep.
4 years ago. In current circumstances, this suggests a likely oscillation in the range well below 30 and above. Supply and demand are balanced or imbalance are small, price range may be smaller. But when imbalances are pronounced, the range will grow. And pricing investment and close can slow economic growth, contributing next bust. The problem of oil is there's always too much or too little. Myron Watkins wrote in 1970 and will be tomorrow. And that's a timeless piece, I believe, Bob. And the other part is, I believe it was you write about, this is the last part, the last paragraph of your book. I'm not sure with your copyright and I'm entitled to read. If it was like a novel, I should not be putting this on screen maybe. And investors, officials, and thinkers will need to innovate and implement coping strategies to deal with mixed blessing of an unmanaged oil market. Welcome back to Past. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to introduce you, Bob McNally. Bob, floor is yours.
Barish, thank you very much for that very kind introduction. I'm going to want that recording and show it to my wife and kids just to, I feel so warm inside after that. I really appreciate that those very kind words and kind sentiment. And I enjoyed writing the book, and I really appreciate it when folks like you of your high stature and your background and so forth find value in it and recommend it. So thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here with you. I'm going to be sharing my screen right now. and delighted to be here with your students. I'm assuming assuming the screen is showing now well on your, okay. I'm really delighted to be here. Thank you for having me, and I look forward to the Q&A with your students and you shortly. I thought what I might do is lay out some of the key themes developed in the book having to do with why oil prices are prone to boom-bust price cycles, why that has been unacceptable to not only the oil industry, but after oil became a strategic commodity when it graduated from illumination to transportation, why that became unacceptable for governments, consumers, and businesses that require a stable oil price and stable oil supplies, and that's just about everybody. And so, and then talk about how supply managers have come into the market and where are we today and kind of looking forward. So I'll just go through some of these slides here. The first one, I put this one up because, you know, when I speak to folks and they say, well, hold on, you wrote a book saying that oil prices are volatile. Folks with more gray hair than me will say, hey, listen, I've been through 3 or 4 cycles on oil. So you're not telling me anything too new, you know. However, the reason I wrote the book is because we haven't seen the price volatility that we've seen in the last 15 years in modern times. You just don't see that near quintupling of oil prices that we saw between 2003 and early 2008 without a war in the Persian Gulf. You don't see oil price spikes, you know, since the 70s without a war in the Persian Gulf. And then you don't see a bust like we saw in 2014 to 2016 without a recession. So we've just seen some unusually large swings in oil prices and without the usual culprits. And I had been working at a hedge fund, wanted to be a historian, always enjoyed history, but I went into the oil markets and was at a hedge fund when I saw the quintupling, and then had started my own firm, Rapid Energy Group, when the bust occurred, and said, you know, to invoke a famous American movie, Wizard of Oz, and there's an expression, we are not in Kansas anymore, meaning this is unusual activity and behavior by oil prices, and it needs to be understood because we hadn't seen it in modern times. So, of course, oil prices have always been cyclical to some degree, and we've always had ups and downs, but we haven't seen the volatility in the last 15, 20 years that we've seen just now before in modern times, and that demands an answer. Why? So when I did my investigation and my research, and I had a fabulous research assistant, Fernando Ferreira, who is still my colleague here at Rapid Energy Group and runs our geopolitical risk service. Fernando and I started digging in. And one thing we did is create that price series that you mentioned, Barish. We needed a monthly continuous crude oil price series going back to the beginning of the modern oil industry in late 1859. And we created that. And happy to discuss perhaps afterwards how we stitched it together. That was quite an odyssey, but we did it. And then that enabled us to see a little more clearly and demarcate these eras of, as you put it, chaos and relative stability. And long story short, you know, we have to realize oil, the price of oil, is naturally prone to wild swings. It is, as economists would say, extremely price inelastic in the short run on the supply and the demand side. Very inelastic. Storage can help temper the volatility, but storage, as we are finding out today, is neither unlimited nor costless. And so what we saw was throughout history, we've had 3, let's call it long-lived supply regulators who have stepped in and provided what naturally doesn't exist in the oil market, which is flexible or quickly adjustable supply. Maybe I'll just back up for a second and explain a little bit about the inelasticity. If you think about oil on the demand side, it is a must-have commodity for which there are no scalable substitutes. Cigars, diamonds, movie theater tickets, those are not must-have commodities. If the price goes up, consumption goes down. But oil, like diapers and food, are must-have commodities for the functioning of modern civilization. And consumers don't really respond much in the short term to price changes. If the price of oil, petrol were to fall in half in Turkey, would Turkish drivers get in the car and just drive around the country because petrol was cheaper? No. If the price were to double in Turkey, would everyone just stop driving right away? No, they have to get to work. They have to get to the supermarket. They have to. It's a commodity that is essential for the functioning of human civilization, and as such, price changes. You have no choice but to pay the price, or if it goes down, you don't increase much your production, your consumption. On the supply side, oil production is a long lead time, many years. We'll talk about shale. U.S. shale is different, but long lead time, 5 to 7 years by the time you find and produce and develop those fields. You spend your capital upfront, most of it, and once you start the field, your operating costs are very low. So you're not going to turn off that oil well just because the daily or the monthly price goes low. And if the price goes really high, you're producing all you can. You're not leaving any unused capacity. You're producing every barrel you can all the time. You want to make that return. You want to earn back that capital that you sunk. So your creditors and your investors. So you're producing 100% and you're not shutting off. So when you have a commodity like this on the demand and supply side, for which demand and supply are both very inelastic or unresponsive, and you have an imbalance in supply and demand, could be because of a recession. It could be because of strong economic growth. It could be because of a health crisis like we just saw. You just don't turn off the supply really fast, nor are you able to increase it. So that's what creates these price ranges between shut-in, where the price goes so low that the producers are forced to abruptly shut down their production. In the old days, they would pour excess oil into wells and streams and things. Once storage fills up, you have no other choice, as we are finding out today, and we're going to find out this summer. And then if there's an imbalance where the market is tight, demand is very strong, supply can't go much higher, there's no excess spare capacity, then the price must rise to destroy demand. The price mechanism, if you think about the oil market, it balances one of two ways, either through the price mechanism, which is a brutal but effective balancer. And when in a tight market, the prices will rise to kill consumption. And that's what happened from 2005 to 2008. We had oil prices rising to kill consumption. You can do that in a growing economy as long as the overall burden of oil expenditures is not too high. By 2008, it got to be too high. So these boom-bust cycles are natural, and they're also impossible for the oil industry and then, as I say, governments to accept. So what you saw in history is 3 controllers stepped in. Mr. Rockefeller, shown there, as the first one. He came in as a refiner. This is when oil was primarily an illumination fuel. And he said, this is impossible, these boom-bust price cycles. He couldn't go and buy every oil field in Pennsylvania, which was the center of the oil world then. So instead, he monopolized refining and integrated with transportation, midstream we call it now, pipelines, railroads. And he brought stability to oil prices. But turning into the 1900s, we didn't like big oil companies, big companies at all, trusts and things like Standard Oil, so we broke it up. He was broken up in 1911, not because he manipulated supply to keep prices stable. Even his detractors appreciated that. More because trusts were unpopular and had nefarious, evil methods. And so we broke up Standard Oil. That triggered the last sustained boom-bust era until the one we're in now. And the book goes into detail. It was horrifying. And now oil is not illumination. That was taken care of by electricity. Now it's going into ships, cars, tanks, and airplanes. World War I was won by oil, largely. And so now, in Mr. Rockefeller's time, governments didn't care too much about oil. Afterwards, the governments cared a lot about oil. So we had a boom-bust period. Oil reverted to these wild swings. And this proved unacceptable to the point where it was the startup of the Black Giant field, a large monster field in Texas in 1930 and 31, that caused, along with the Depression, oil prices to go down to pennies on the barrel. And this caused the next swing producer group to come in, the Texans. The Texas Railroad Commission, state regulators, other oil states came in, and instead of trying to regulate or cartelize refining and midstream, they decided to go with wellhead control, setting quotas month by month on the physical production of oil at the wellhead. And they did it very strictly. They did it in combination with the Seven Sisters, the big international major oil companies that then controlled the Middle East oil fields. They worked together. Happy to discuss that in the Q&A. They had a great run. People forget that the Texas Railroad Commission was by far the most successful regulator and stabilizer of oil prices the world has ever seen. OPEC took over for the Texas Railroad Commission. The founders of OPEC patterned themselves. They wanted to copy the Texas Railroad Commission. They admired the Texas Railroad Commission. Their reign, we'll see shortly, was not quite as effective as Texas. But in my view, OPEC lost control in 2008. And they lost control of the oil market for the same way Texas lost control in 1972, in a boom. Oil prices were soaring. Demand was very strong. The swing producer, then Texas, then OPEC in 2008, was not investing in enough spare production capacity, and prices soared, and their reign ended. Here is a very shameless plug. You've already done a great job, so we won't spend much time here on this slide from my book. But the picture on the right is a picture of Texas sending National Guard troops. They mobilized the military and sent them into the fields in 1931 to literally stop the drillers from drilling. And I put this in here just as a point to make. Texans, and I admire Texans. I worked for a Texan president, George W. Bush. I'm from Connecticut, but I admire Texans. Texans are the most government-limiting people on earth. They're also the most oil-producing people on earth. They're very good at that. So are the Oklahomans. But consider that oil price volatility caused Texans and Oklahomans to do something that's very unnatural, to first send troops in to stop drillers from drilling on their own property. And then, as I said, to impose quotas for 4 decades that would make OPEC envious. It just shows you how important oil price stability is for everybody. And that's an important point for today and going forward. Here's the slide, Barish, you mentioned very briefly, showing the eras. So what I did is I took my monthly continuous crude oil price series. I took an average of the changes in a year, month to month, monthly changes in a year, the range. I grouped those by the eras that I demarcate. So the first era there, the wild boom bust phase was crazy, 53%. Mr. Rockefeller comes in, cuts it in half. We break up Rockefeller, go back to the second boom bust era, about 36%. And then the Texas Railroad Commission come in. It was very, very effective. OPEC takes over for Texas Railroad Commission, about as effective as Rockefeller. And since 2008, we've been in the post-OPEC era, in my view, and the volatility shows it. I want to show you this slide here, and I want to direct you to the 1950s. The blue lines there show you spare production capacity. What is spare production capacity? Spare production capacity is what results when a regulator or a cartel decides to order production of oil to go down for the purposes of stabilizing prices. Again, it creates something that, as we said, does not normally exist. Quickly producible oil. Normally, you never do that. You only, by doing so, you're giving your competitors an edge and so forth. And so what I've shown here is spare production capacity as a percent of global oil market production. And before 1972, this was held by the Texas Railroad Commission and other US states and the Seven Sisters. Look at the 1950s, if you will. 35% of global oil market production was being held off the market. 20% plus in the US, the rest in the Middle East. Consider any economic activity on the planet, especially one as important as oil, where regulators or cartel go to shut down that much production to keep oil prices very stable. You can see the black line is price stability. That, I think, is a measure of how seriously, again, we took oil price stability. The reason they did that is because they remembered the boom-bust era from the 20s and 30s. We are currently in a boom-bust era, which is going to teach us this lesson again. So let's look forward a little bit and go back to the chart that I showed in the beginning. What does the future look like? I think the big question is, will we have an effective swing producer? If we will, then while oil prices will not be perfectly stable, they never have been, we should expect a range to be imposed. So if OPEC Plus or some new group decides, look, we have to have some stability here between, let's say, $50 and $80 a barrel, 60 and 70, something like that, we can then maybe expect a period of relatively stable prices. This would be a positive thing for global economic growth, geopolitical stability, investors in every kind of energy, alternative energy, conventional energy, et cetera, et cetera. If we will not have a swing producer, though, an effective one, we must buckle up and get ready for prices to range, as they have been doing, between shut-in levels in the single digits and demand destruction levels well into the triple digits, in my view. Okay, so then will we have a swing producer? That's the bazillion-dollar question. That's the question we will be left with after the coronavirus fades. We still have this question. So I think here, people say, well, shale oil is going to be the new swing producer because shale oil is more flexible. And it is true. Shale oil responds more quickly than conventional oil to prices. That is because shale oil is a relatively high operating cost production system compared to long conventional oil fields, and it has very steep decline rates. And so if you stop drilling new wells in shale, you quickly get declines and production responds at the field or the aggregate level. So that's true. It's much more flexible, but shale oil is not swing production. And here we have to be very precise. We have to understand what we're talking about when we say swing production. And here's my chart comparing past swing producers, OPEC plus, and then I just added this morning this new OPEC plus plus, which has come up in the last few weeks. First of all, a swing producer must be willing and able to surrender market share to their competitors for the purposes of price stability. Texas was willing to do that. OPEC was willing to do that. Shale oil producers are not willing to do that, not voluntarily. They must be able to act quickly, within weeks. The Texas Railroad Commission met every month. An OPEC meets, or OPEC plus, they implement their decisions usually in a few weeks. Shale oil, as we said, first of all, doesn't adjust its production to keep prices stable. There's thousands of companies all competing with each other. And when they do respond to prices, it's after quarters and it's too late. So shale oil is not flexible enough. This is very important. Legal authority. Texas has it. OPEC has it. OPEC plus has it. It's questionable about whether all the members of the G20 have it, to what degree, and so forth. That's more of an open question. Shale oil doesn't have it. Even if shale oil producers wanted to surrender market share, could collectively organize and agree on cuts, were willing to do that and could do it fast enough. If they did it, they would all go right to jail because that's illegal under the Sherman Antitrust Act. Congress would have to pass a law saying you're allowed to do this. I don't see that happening. So there's some other conditions here. I think my point is clear. Shale oil is not swing production. If shale oil was swing production, which is what people thought in 2014, oil would not have fallen to $26 a barrel in 2016. It would have stopped at 80, which is what people thought. It didn't. Shale is not swing production. The real question is this new alliance of OPEC and the non-OPEC producers led by Saudi Arabia and Russia. Will it be the new producer? I think the jury is still out, meaning that's still an open question. They have had some success since 2016 at reducing supply. They have been helped by President Trump, who has, if you will, contributed Iranian cuts through sanctions and Venezuelan cuts. So they have had some help, OPEC plus. We saw the alliance between Russia and Saudi Arabia burst apart in March after the coronavirus came around. There, the problem was the demand collapse was too big. Arguably, no swing producer could handle this. I'm not even sure the Texans could have handled the coronavirus and that demand destruction. So now OPEC plus have come back together. Saudi Arabia and Russia are cooperating. President Trump put that deal back together. In my view, price busts will still scare producers into at least temporary cartels. During previous boom-bust eras, back in the 1800s and the 1920s, you saw temporary cartels form. The first one was called the Oil Creek Association in 1861. They don't last very long. But what we really need is a long-term swing producer, an institutional swing producer. In my view, OPEC plus is unlikely to be that. I think, though, they're more likely to fail when demand is very strong. They're not holding enough spare production capacity. It'll go up now because of the cuts, but when we get back to normal, looking back at spare capacity there, maybe I'll just go back to my spare chart. You see in the bottom right-hand corner, now it's going to be 5%, maybe a little higher, but usually it's 2 to 3%. That's getting very low. In my view, in the future, demand will be strong, supply will be weak, and OPEC Plus, even if it holds together, is likely to sort of finally fail in the way that Texas did and OPEC did in 2008 by really losing control of the upside and prices going higher. So I know I've gone on and on. I think I've touched on the high points, the main points I wanted to make here in this public session. Again, Baris, I want to thank you very much for inviting me to expound a little bit on the themes of the book. I want to thank everybody for listening. For those of you who won't be joining us for the discussion with the students, rapidanenergy.com. You can get to me through there, Twitter, and so forth. Again, appreciate it, Baris, very much. Thank you, and I look forward to the conversation with you and your students here shortly.
All right, thank you, Bob. It was an excellent presentation. And if you want to reach Bob McNally, we reached through his Twitter address, which is Bob_McNally. So it was a pleasure to have him. So we are cutting the live session here.